paper, an avatar is being beaten, sadism, masochism, and haunting ground. I'll be touching on issues of sadism and masochism, and also sexual threat. So, as the introduction suggested, I'm the author of a recently published book entitled "Video Games in the Gothic." This was really the culmination of a lot of work that I've been doing around video games and issues to do with the horror genre. In this book, I argue that there has, throughout video games history, been a really interesting relationship with the Gothic. Video games have always been full of things like locked doors, hidden passageways, neo-medieval iconography. Some really classic examples there from Gauntlet and some early adventure games. Themes to do with the uncanny, the spectral. Ruins also seem to appear quite frequently within video games. And I argue that there is something about the Gothic genre or the Gothic milieu which really fits with video games, almost to the point where the video game medium might be understood to be a kind of Gothic formation in itself. Think about discussions of games in terms of things like the magic circle, or the idea that games produce a kind of half-real environment for players to become engaged with. So some of the games which I talk about in the case studies in this book includes ones which have already been mentioned. So I write about BioShock, Gone Home, What Remains of Edith Finch, Night in the Woods, and I argue that each of these titles fits in with a different tradition or a different history of Gothic literature. My background is very much in media and cultural studies, so I'm not coming to this from a kind of literature studies perspective, but I have spent a great deal of time sort of researching the relationship between literary tropes with the Gothic and a whole series of video games. And one which I start off by writing about, which is a bit of a gift in many ways, to the point where I think some of the analysis that I'm doing here is potentially more descriptive than analytical. This is a game from 2005 entitled Haunting Ground. It's quite an obscure title. It's quite hard to get hold of. When I was researching this and trying to find images to go with this talk, I found copies of it on eBay for up to £100. So it's quite a hard to find title. It's a third-person adventure game, very much in the survival horror tradition. It was published by Konami. According to a number of sources that I've found, it was originally going to be a sequel to the Clock Tower series, but it is a standalone title which features a protagonist called Fiona Belly, who is the heroine, trapped in a labyrinthine castle. The game is full of medieval iconography, references to alchemy, and yet at the same time the game is very much set in the kind of modern world. So we have that kind of something that's been mentioned before, that sense of time being out of joint. This is a game which has all the imagery and a lot of the themes of kind of a Gothic horror story, and yet is set in present day. It's a game which features, the environment features lots of dolls and mummies and puppets. It's a game which is very interesting in terms of the way in which it's reflecting upon the position of the avatar within the video game formation, which is something I've written about previously. There's a dog companion that the protagonist has, and you can control the dog and make the dog attack various adversaries. Very much in the same way as the player is controlling Fiona herself. So there's this really interesting kind of like levels of self-reflexivity going on within the game. Throughout the progress of the game, the story is fairly kind of oblique, but the protagonist moves through a whole series of spaces within this castle, a series of levels, and each one they encounter a different adversary. And the intention of the game is the goal of the game is purely to escape from the castle. So one of the first points of reference that I used when discussing this game is a chapter written by Shira Chess on the Ravenhurst game series. And Chess argues that the Ravenhurst series parallels in many ways traditional Gothic fiction insofar as it's very much a genre. The paid casual game is very much associated with female players. It's a genre which is often overlooked, marginalized within the kind of the sort of hierarchy of games where the AAA titles are right at the top, and these are kind of fairly low down in that in terms of ranking. It's a game which is also, like Haunting Ground, very explicitly, clearly drawing on traditions of Gothic fiction. It has an 18th century woman imprisoned and victimized within a kind of very clearly Gothic location. The games are full of ghosts, automatons, references to the occult. And Chess draws upon a range of Gothic scholars, Gothic literary scholars, to situate this game within that particular genre and that particular tradition. So Tanya Mydleski, Gina Whisker, Eve Sedgwick, writers who I've also drawn upon. So Chess's work was very much a kind of inspiration to me. And much like the Ravenhurst games, this is a game which is very clearly set within a Gothic location. It's recognizably Gothic, even to those of us who haven't studied the Gothic as a genre. The castle, although it does have some modern aspects to it, it is very clearly in terms of its architecture, drawing upon the medieval. It's full of plush furniture and portraits hanging from the walls, often with kind of people looking through them, strange twisting corridors, circular staircases. And yeah, at the same time, we also occasionally come across a television set or a B-day. So it also has that slightly kind of like strange temporal aspect to it, which I think games also, we might also say within the game, this is a game which came out in 2005 and is clearly drawing upon a kind of a certain tradition of literature, which might not be particularly familiar to the implied audience for this game. So there's also something quite peculiar about the game itself and its own historical relationship, as well as being set in this very clearly Gothic location. In which the protagonist, the heroine, is trapped. We also have a parade of villains who, in the various levels that you progress through, are trying to attack the heroine and also relate to various traditions within the Gothic. So on the left there is the cook, who is this very kind of like gigantic figure. In the middle, that's someone who seems to be a kind of an android maid who also attacks the heroine. Ricardo is very clearly monastic in their design, potentially kind of Italian in their naming. So there's lots of very interesting kind of like almost borderline explicit references to the Gothic fiction going on here, and I argue that this is very much a game set in the kind of Radcliffe template of tales of persecuted, often naive, sometimes hysterical, sometimes paranoid heroines drawn into disorientated environments, threatened yet attracted by dark villains, and lost in disturbing yet exciting worlds of amorous and adventurous possibilities. That's from Fred Botting. We have, I'm not going to read these in much detail, but we have got castles in a state of dilapidation, winding passages, the tyrannical men. There's a constant kind of like a sexual dimension to the villains who are trying to attack Fiona. We have the kind of trembling sensibility of the heroine, the tyrannical older man, as Sedgwick says, the terrified heroine. This seems to be a recurring theme. And we have the shy, nervous, retiring heroine, possessed of a remarkable ability to survive hideously dangerous situations. It's almost like a kind of description of the your traditional survival horror heroine. There's something very interesting about this game and its relationship to the Gothic, and the ways in which gender also kind of features within this. And I argue that Fiona is a resoundingly feminine character insofar as not just in terms of audiovisual design, but also in terms of the mechanics which surround her. So like a lot of survival horror games, there's nothing in the way of kind of particularly powerful weapons within this title. The main actions which Fiona performs in order to survive are running away, kicking, which is not particularly effective, hiding. There's lots of one of the main mechanics of the game whenever a villain is encountered is to find somewhere to hide and to stay there until the villain has disappeared. It's a recurring a mechanic in these kinds of games. Other gendering elements, there are clothing, items of clothing, such as a necklace which provide power-ups. In order to calm herself down, Fiona splashes water on her face, uses chamomile or lavender. These are items that you can find within the game world, which act as sort of like health restoring items. And it's hard to imagine more kind of like masculine protagonists in games employing a similar kind of mechanic. There's also something interesting about the way in which Fiona is sexualized and objectified by the characters within the game. As I said, this is a game which is full of dolls and puppets. There's a mummy which is encountered at one point, like a figure swaddled in bandages, a pregnant figure swaddled in bandages, and there's a very clear analogy between that object and potentially Fiona's future. There's lots of voyeuristic cutscenes. As I said, all of the characters seem to have some kind of designs upon Fiona's body. And we also have, and this is another technique that we see, a device that we quite often see in survival horrors, I'm sure most of you are familiar with. This is a kind of panic meter. So whenever Fiona gets too close to an adversary, then she starts, the screen starts to distort. She starts falling over. It becomes increasingly hard to control her. Hopefully you can see the GIFs that I've got running there. You can see the distortion, the way in which the protagonist is kind of like moving erratically from side to side. It becomes increasingly difficult to control the character when placed in these positions. And I would argue that here we've got the kind of trembling sensibility of the heroine translated into a kind of gameplay mechanic. There's a comparable device there on the right there in Clock Tower 3. So one of the things I found really interesting about this game, and it's a game which I wrote about a few years ago in relation to what I was sort of trying to work through, a sort of avatar theory, trying to understand what avatars are and how players relate to avatars, and trying to kind of basically kind of like come to terms with what is this entity known as the avatar, or what is a video game character, and how can this be related to traditions within cinema or traditions within literature. And one of the conclusions I come to is it's actually a very shifting position that we have in relation to a character like Fiona within this game. On the one hand, they are in some ways a position, a figure of identification, insofar as they respond to the interactive device that we're using. They seem to be a kind of puppet which we are controlling. We want them to evade the adversaries, and in the same as we want to complete the game, so we identify with the protagonist's desire also to avoid harm. And at the same time, they are figures of voyeurism as avatars, I would argue, but also in cutscenes, particularly in this game, there are moments where we are very clearly seeing Fiona from the perspective of one of the villains who is out to get them. That's something which is introduced really early on in the game. They're also a figure of frustration, particularly the moments where Fiona starts to panic, and as a player you lose control of her movements. They are a figure which is punished, so we see repeatedly Fiona getting beaten, getting hurt, getting crushed, getting attacked, in various ways by the adversaries that she encounters. But also she is a punisher. She does, if you succeed in the game, then you do defeat all of these villains, often in quite gruesome ways. So you push one off a water tower, you drop a chandelier onto another. I think yes, the maid character gets impaled on a shard of glass. So this kind of like sadomasochistic dynamic, which I'd sort of touched upon previously when I was explicitly researching this game in relation to the Gothic. I found Michel A. Massey's book, In the Name of Love, Women, Masochism and the Gothic, really useful. It seemed to be kind of like touching upon something which was going on in this game, and also something which I think can be potentially applied to other games, because I think that maybe these elements are more explicit within Haunting Ground because of its generic location, but I think these aspects can be seen across games from a whole range of different genres. And Massey talks about this, the Freudian fantasy, a child is being beaten. And in this scenario, or in this fantasy formation, Freud argues there are three potential figures, three potential points of identification or entry for the fantasist. One is the position of the beater, which is a sadistic one. One is the figure of the child, which is a masochistic one, and one which is the position of the spectator, which is a voyeuristic one. So we have various of quote unquote perverse positions. And I did use this image of The Simpsons originally as a kind of joke, but I have subsequently been thinking about why it is that this moment of The Simpsons, the most successful TV show in the history of TV, is so iconic, and wondering what Freud would say about that. But as I said, in Haunting Ground, there is this kind of very interesting sadomasochistic, voyeuristic dynamic. In cutscenes, we quite often see Fiona being traumatized or being imperiled by various figures. At the same time, and also we see her dying in a whole range of different ways, which again is not uncommon within video games. But there are also moments of sadism where we see Fiona getting the dog to attack, often in quite unpleasant ways, the various adversaries, and each level ends with a quite spectacular death of one of the villains, often explicitly as a consequence of Fiona's actions. There is also, and I will put a link to this in the chat, there is a really interesting moment, and if I was giving this live, I would show you the exact scene. There's a moment where Fiona actually looks through a keyhole and sees Daniela, the maid, being beaten by one of the villains, and it is a really interesting, obscure, weird, strange moment within quite a strange game, which almost seems to be, and this was a point where I thought, is this something that the game makers are aware of? Are they including this as a kind of Freudian shout out? Because certainly the work that I've done on Silent Hill does suggest that games designers are very much aware of themes to do with the uncanny and Oedipal complexes and so on. These aren't just restricted to games authors or games critics. So yeah, I found this very interesting to kind of work through all the different kind of like dynamics that this game entails. In writing in 2012, I talked about the masochistic subjective position, or the masochistic subject position, which I'm sure most of us, if you're a gamer, are familiar with that experience of playing a game over and over again to the point where it stops being fun, it starts to get quite boring, it's frustrating. I think there is a masochistic element to video games, which is maybe worth exploring. I know that Bo Ruberg has written about games not being fun, and that I think is a really interesting way of exploring certain aspects of video game experiences. And Miles, a Gothic literature scholar, also talks about the masochistic subject position of the reader, which I thought was quite an interesting parallel there. Diane Carr talks about the player as a sadistic figure. So we have that kind of counteract position. And Carl here is particularly talking about Lara Croft and the way in which she kind of like kills a parade of nameless victims in a very kind of sadistic manner. And sadism has probably got more kind of attention in video game, certainly popular video game circles, than masochism. Stobart, Dawn Stobart, in a book about a more recent book on horror video games, talks about the Clock Tower series as involving certain moments of sadism, and given the relationship between the two games, I thought that was really interesting. So Massey talks about the ambivalent third party, the voyeur looking at the child being beaten, and I argue that the player is quite an ambivalent figure within the video games. We are sort of outside of the game, and yet we are also controlling it. Massey says, what is one to make of such a picture, this being the kind of Freudian child is being beaten? Is it sadistic, masochistic, voyeuristic? Why is it so unvarying? Is its persistent repetition an attempt to recover from trauma, to maintain the image? Is it pleasure, pain, and why must there be a spectator? And these are questions which I think we could very easily turn around and think about in relation to not just games that are clearly gothic in their orientation, but games in general. So I think there's something really interesting about the shifting subjective position of the player. We experience game avatars in different ways at different moments. Sometimes we're in a sadistic position, we're beating villains. Sometimes we're in a masochistic position where we're being beaten. We have moments of frustration, the experience of being beaten by the game. So not just characters, but the game itself. And there is also something quite circular and deterministic and repetitive about video game play, which I think ties in with some of the themes that Massey is talking about. And the discussion of the spectator, the fantasy as a kind of wish fulfilling puppet master of the scene, I think also has some really interesting parallels with video games in general.